My family's vineyard was destroyed by a wildfire. As I watched it burn, my parents saved a sculpture. Not me. They called me a liability. So I called the one person who knew the vineyard's true worth. The boy I grew up with, who was now a billionaire. He answered on the first ring, and with 2 words he changed everything. He said, "I'm coming." The flames ate everything with a terrifying hunger, turning 100 years of legacy into smoke and ash. I stood there, choking on the air, my face stained with soot and tears. But the heat of the fire was nothing compared to the ice in my heart as I watched my father, Robert, and my mother, Susan, direct the estate workers. They weren't saving family photos or my grandfather's antique winemaking tools. They were saving a 7-foot-tall bronze sculpture called Ascension, a monstrosity they'd bought for $250,000. They wrapped it in fire-retardant blankets while I stood there, literally watching my life burn down. I screamed my father's name, but he just waved a dismissive hand, too busy protecting his investment. It wasn't just a vineyard, it was my home, my memories, my future. And they chose a piece of metal over their own daughter. That night, with nowhere else to go, I drove my old truck to their sterile Dallas mansion. My father opened the door, his face a mask of annoyance. "Jessica, what are you doing here? You can't stay with us." His voice was flat, devoid of any warmth. I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the cruelty. "The vineyard is gone," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Everything is gone. I have nowhere else to go." My mother appeared behind him, her perfectly coiffed hair untouched by the tragedy miles away. "Darling, you have to understand our position," she said, her tone the one she used for difficult staff. "We have a brand to maintain. Having you here looking like that, it sends the wrong message to our investors and social circle. It suggests instability. Brand management. That's what I was. A risk to their portfolio. A dip in their social stock." My father nodded in agreement. "It's a strategic decision, Jessica. Your trauma is a liability we simply cannot afford right now. It's messy." I felt the ground disappear from under me. They weren't my parents. They were corporate raiders, and I was a failed asset being liquidated. I must have looked as broken as I felt because my father's expression softened, but not with pity. It was with impatience. He disappeared for a moment and came back holding a small blackened leather book. "This survived. It was your grandfather's." He pushed the scorched journal into my hands. It was a final, callous dismissal. A worthless, burned book in exchange for a home, a family, a life. He closed the door with a quiet, decisive click, leaving me alone on his marble porch with nothing but ashes and the ghost of a man who would have saved me first. The engine of my old pickup coughed to life, the only familiar sound in a world that had become silent and strange. I had $118 to my name and a quarter tank of gas. I sat there in the pristine quiet of their gated community, the sheer cruelty of it all crashing down on me. My phone buzzed, a text from my mother. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an offer of help. It was a link to a list of local homeless shelters. The message below it read, "Perhaps this is the wake-up call you need to start planning your future more responsibly. They might be able to help." Homeless. My own mother called me homeless. That one word, so clinical and cold, did something to me. The despair that had been choking me began to harden, crystallizing into something sharp and unbending. Resolve. As I stared at their perfect house, my mind didn't see the parents who had just abandoned me. It saw a sun-drenched afternoon years ago, back at the vineyard. I was 12, and Matthew Cole, the quiet, lanky boy from the struggling farm down the road, was helping my grandfather fix an irrigation line. His hands were always covered in grease, his clothes were second-hand, but his eyes were sharper than anyone I knew. My parents tolerated him because my grandfather insisted, but they saw him as charity. I saw him as my only real friend. That day my grandfather held up a clump of the rich, dark soil. "This is the real legacy, kids," he'd said, his voice thick with passion. "Not the money, not the big house. This dirt. It has a secret, a fire deep inside it that gives our grapes their soul." Matthew had nodded, his gaze serious. "I can feel it," he'd whispered, letting the soil run through his fingers. "Feels warm." We were the only two who ever understood what he meant. We were heirs to the vineyard's spirit, not just its property. My parents had inherited the land, but they'd never understood its soul. They saw it as a backdrop for their social climbing. Matthew and I, we saw it as a living thing. Now, sitting in my truck, clutching my grandfather's scorched journal, I knew there was only one person on this earth who would understand the depth of what I'd lost. My finger hovered over a name in my phone I hadn't called in a decade. Would he even remember me? He was a tech mogul now, a name whispered in business magazines. What if he was just like them now, cold and calculating? But I had nothing left to lose. I pressed the call button before I could lose my nerve. My parents had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. They had no idea who they'd just turned away. And they had no idea who I was about to call. The phone rang twice, each ring echoing the frantic beat of my heart. I was about to hang up, convinced this was a stupid, desperate mistake when a voice answered. Hello. It was deeper, more confident, but the warmth underneath was unmistakable. It was still him. Matthew. My voice was barely a whisper. It's Jesse. Jesse Miller. There was a split second of silence and then the change in his voice was electric. Jesse? Oh my God. Are you okay? Where are you? He remembered. Not only did he remember, but his first thought was for my safety. The dam inside me broke and tears I didn't know I had left started streaming down my face. I'm so sorry to call you like this, I sobbed. I know it's been forever, I didn't know who else. Stop, he said, his voice firm but gentle. Don't you dare apologize. You can call me anytime for anything. You know that. Now tell me what happened. So I told him everything. The fire. The sculpture. My parents' brutal words about brand management and liabilities. The text message with a link to homeless shelters. The words poured out of me, a torrent of grief and betrayal. He listened without interruption, his silence punctuated by quiet, sharp intakes of breath that sounded like controlled rage. When I finished, the silence on the line was different. It was heavy, dangerous. Jesse, he said finally, his voice low and tight with fury. Stay where you are. Don't move. Are you in your truck? I confirmed I was, still parked down the street from my parents' house. Good. There's a Four Seasons hotel about 15 minutes from you. I'm booking you the presidential suite right now. It'll be under your name. Go there, order whatever you want from room service and get some sleep. I'm on my way. My mind struggled to keep up. On your way. Matthew, you're in California. That's across the country. My jet will be in the air in 30 minutes, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. I'll be there by morning. We'll sort this out together. The next morning he arrived and he wasn't alone. With him was a woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper suit who he introduced as Rachel Vance, his chief of staff. He hugged me, a long, protective embrace that made me feel safe for the first time in days. Then his expression hardened. First, we go back to the vineyard, he said. We drove in a black SUV that appeared out of nowhere. Standing before the blackened fields and the skeletal remains of my home, the grief hit me all over again. I thought he would see the same thing I did, a total, heartbreaking loss. But Matthew stared out at the devastation with a strange light in his eyes. They have no idea what they threw away, he said, more to himself than to me. This isn't a ruin, Jesse. This is a foundation. I stood there in the ashes, clutching my grandfather's journal like a shield. The smell of wet soot hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of all I had lost. My body shook with a grief so profound it felt like a physical illness. Matthew put a steadying arm around my shoulders. He loved this place more than anything, I whispered, my voice hoarse. He used to say the land had a fire in its heart. As I spoke, my grip on the journal tightened and a few stiff yellowed pages, tucked into a pocket inside the leather cover, slipped out and fluttered to the ground. Matthew bent down to pick them up, his brow furrowed in concentration. They weren't journal entries. They were old, folded documents, brittle with age. He carefully unfolded one. Jesse, what are these? He asked, his voice suddenly charged with excitement. They look like geological surveys. He pointed to a series of complex diagrams and notations. By God. Look at this. Thermal gradients, seismic data. Jesse, your grandfather wasn't being poetic. There's a massive geothermal energy source right beneath our feet. A unique one. Clean, powerful, and completely untapped. It was the legacy blueprint. The secret my grandfather knew the land held. As we were trying to process the magnitude of this discovery, Rachel Vance's phone rang. She had been standing off to the side, quietly making calls since we arrived. She listened for a moment, her expression unreadable, before saying, "Send me the documents immediately. I'll confirm." She hung up and turned to us, her eyes locked on me. "Jesse," she began, her voice calm and precise, "I've been reviewing the property's public records with our legal team. There's something you need to know." She took a deep breath. 10 years ago, your parents were facing a significant estate tax assessment. To mitigate it, their lawyers advised them to transfer any underperforming or worthless assets into a child's name to reduce the overall value of their estate. My heart started pounding. "What are you saying?" Matthew asked, already understanding where this was going. Rachel's gaze didn't waver. They saw the vineyard as a financial drain. "So, to dodge a tax bill, Robert and Susan Miller signed 100% of the deed for these 900 acres, and all mineral and resource rights solely into your name. The transfer was irrevocable." She held up her phone, displaying a digital copy of a legal document. "They never told you because they intended to have you sign it back once you were older, but they forgot. They forgot they'd given you everything." The world tilted on its axis. The surveys in my hand, the deed on Rachel's phone. My parents, in their endless greed and arrogance, hadn't just abandoned me. They had accidentally made me the sole owner of a future tech empire. The next few weeks were a blur of strategy sessions and legal briefings. Matthew's company, Nexus Terra, was a global leader in sustainable technology. The geothermal source beneath my land wasn't just a lucky break. It was a revolution. His team of engineers and architects began drafting plans for something extraordinary, the world's first truly green hyperscale data center, powered entirely by the clean energy pulsing beneath the ash. The project would be massive, creating thousands of jobs and generating billions in revenue. And the first thing we earmarked the profits for? To build a new state-of-the-art vineyard and winery on the ridge overlooking the facility, a tribute to my grandfather that would honor his legacy in a way my parents never could. We kept the initial geological surveys quiet, letting a different story leak out to the local community. Word began to spread that the Miller property was suddenly a hotbed of activity. Drills were brought in, surveyors swarmed the land. The rumor my parents heard, the one we wanted them to hear, was simple and believable. Jesse struck oil. It took less than a week for their greed to take the bait. A letter arrived from their high-powered law firm, announcing their intent to sue me. They claimed I, their naive and impressionable daughter, had somehow manipulated them into signing over the property years ago. They accused me of fraud, of elder abuse, of taking advantage of their generous nature. It was so absurd it would have been laughable if it wasn't so venomous. Their lawyer demanded an emergency mediation meeting, confident they could intimidate me into handing over my newfound oil money. They walked into that polished boardroom in their lawyer's downtown office like conquering heroes. My father gave me a look of condescending pity, while my mother appraised my simple dress with a smirk. They had no idea they weren't walking into a negotiation. They were walking into a perfectly laid trap, one their own greed had built. They saw me sitting there alone with Matthew and Rachel and assumed I'd brought a friend for moral support. They had no concept of the power arrayed against them. They believed they were about to crush their broken, homeless daughter. They had no idea they were about to be professionally and systematically annihilated. They were so busy planning how to spend my money they never once stopped to consider that I might now have a power they couldn't possibly comprehend. They were about to learn that some legacies aren't written in bank statements, but in loyalty, and that the worthless daughter they threw away was now the one who held all the cards. The air in the conference room was thick with arrogance. My parents' lawyer, a man with a booming voice and an expensive suit, launched into his opening statement. He painted a picture of me as a cunning, manipulative freeloader who had taken advantage of her loving, trusting parents. He spoke of their generosity, their pain at my betrayal, and their rightful claim to the significant fossil fuel deposits I had stolen from them. My father nodded gravely, a picture of paternal sorrow. My mother dabbed at a dry eye with a silk handkerchief. It was a masterful performance. When he finished, the room was silent. He looked at me, expecting me to crumble. I just nodded to Rachel. Rachel Vance stood up, calm and composed. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Thank you for that creative piece of fiction," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like glass. "Now let's discuss reality." She clicked a button on a remote and the large screen behind her flickered to life. It wasn't a diagram of oil deposits. It was a stunning architectural rendering of a massive, futuristic campus. "This," Rachel announced, "is the Miller Legacy Project. It is a $4 billion green data center and sustainable winery, fully funded by Nexus Terra, and powered by a unique geothermal source located on the property." My parents' faces went slack with confusion. "What is this?" my father stammered. Rachel advanced the slide. A corporate hierarchy chart appeared on the screen. At the very top, under the title of Founder and Chief Executive Officer, was my name, Jessica Miller. "As the sole legal owner of the land and all its resource rights," Rachel continued, her voice even and devastating, My client, Miss Miller, has entered into a partnership with Nexus Terra to develop her property. She clicked the remote again. A high-resolution scan of a legal document filled the screen. My father's confident signature was visible at the bottom. And this, she said, is the irrevocable deed of transfer, drafted by your own legal team 10 years ago, gifting the property to your daughter to avoid a tax liability. A document you, Mr. Miller, signed yourself. Checkmate. The color drained from my father's face. My mother looked like she was going to be sick. Their lawyer was speechless, staring at the screen as if it were an execution order. The truth had landed not with a shout, but with the cold, quiet finality of a gavel strike. Months later, I stood on a hill overlooking the construction site. The rhythmic sounds of progress had replaced the silence of ash. Below me, the foundations of the data center were being laid, and on the ridge where I stood, the first vines of the new vineyard were taking root. My grandfather's scorched journal sat on the passenger seat of my truck, its pages filled with his dreams for this land. The fire hadn't destroyed his legacy. It had burned away everything that was holding it back. It had burned away my parents' greed, their shallow ambitions, their control over me. It had cleared the way for something